What would you do if you walked on your worst nightmare, your father, in the act with your own child? This is a story of a Michigan cop forced to make a decision no one should ever face, a decision that would change his life forever and tear a family apart. 9 shots, one devastating discovery, and a moment so shocking, it's almost impossible to comprehend. Tonight, we dive into a case where justice and bloodlines collide, leaving you wondering, was there any other choice? This is not just a crime. This is a nightmare that no one saw coming. What happens next will haunt you forever. Stay tuned, because this story is unlike anything you've ever heard. In a quiet corner of Michigan, nestled in a neighborhood where the streets are lined with leafy trees and the sound of children laughing fills the air, nothing ever seemed out of place. It was the kind of town where you could walk down the street and nod to a neighbor without a second thought, where the hustle of the outside world seemed a distant memory. Families gathered for barbecues. Joggers ran along tree-lined paths, and the days unfolded without a whisper of the horrors lurking in the shadows. But in this peaceful community, there was a story hidden behind every door, a story about a cop, a father, and a daughter, a family torn apart in the most unimaginable way. On the surface, things seemed perfect, didn't they? The cop, well-respected and trusted by his peers, had everything going for him. His father, a man who had been there for him through thick and thin, had always been a steady force in his life. And then there was his daughter, a sweet, 10-year-old girl, blind since birth, whose world had always been one of trust and love. Everything appeared normal. The neighborhood was as peaceful as ever. The cop had just come home after a long shift, expecting nothing more than the quiet of his own home. But that night, everything would change. What could possibly have broken this illusion of normalcy? Was it something hidden in plain sight, something no one ever saw coming? Could a lifetime of family bonds really be shattered in an instant, or had there been cracks all along, waiting to split wide open? As the cop walked through the door, the warmth of the evening air greeted him. Familiar, comforting, but inside, the silence was deafening. A silence that should have felt safe, but now, for reasons unknown, felt like the calm before a storm. Was he prepared for what he was about to discover? Could anyone ever be? And as he stepped deeper into that quiet home, one question echoed in his mind. Was this the moment when everything fell apart? Because what he would find next would not only haunt him for the rest of his life, but would challenge everything he thought he knew about family, trust, and the line between right and wrong. The story of the cop and his father was one that screamed drama. It wasn't filled with bitter arguments, public displays of anger, or any of the classic struggles you might expect from a complicated father-son relationship. It was subtle, quiet, but that's what made it so dangerous, because the things that are left unspoken can often be the ones that cut the deepest. The cop had grown up with a father who was a man of few words. In the world they lived in, silence was a language of its own. But that wasn't a bad thing, was it? There was something reassuring about the stillness. His father had taught him to stay strong, to never show weakness, to always do what was right. "The world is not kind, son," he would say. "You have to make your own way." His father wasn't the kind to show affection openly, but the cop had never questioned it. He had never needed the words. The silent gestures, fixing things around the house, standing guard when things got tough, were enough. And the love his father had for his daughter, the blind girl who couldn't see but would feel her father's love in every hug, in every word he spoke, in every step he took to guide her through a world of darkness, that love was everything. It was unspoken, yes, but it was there. She couldn't see him, but she could sense the strength and protection that surrounded her. Yet, there were always moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible moments, that the cop couldn't shake. Moments when his father's gaze would linger just a second too long. His voice would soften in a way that didn't sit right. He had brushed it off before. Fathers get older. They change. It's nothing to worry about, right? But as time passed, those moments became harder to ignore. And it wasn't just his father's behavior that troubled him. It was the tension, that creeping unease that settled between them when they were together. What was happening between them? Why did the air feel thick with unspoken words every time they stood in the same room? There were days when the cop would notice his father acting strange, more withdrawn, more erratic in his movements, as if there were a secret brewing beneath the surface. And then there was his daughter. The cop's love for her was fierce. His blind, sweet, innocent girl. She was his world. But could there be something in his own home, something so insidious, so wrong, that his love for her couldn't protect her from it? Had the cop missed the signs? The subtle shifts, the silent alarms going off around him, warning him that something was not right? Or had he been too blind himself to see what was happening? The cop loved his daughter with an intensity that scared him sometimes. She was everything to him, his one constant in an unpredictable world. But his father had always been there. But now, there were whispers in his mind. Was this the man who would protect his daughter? Or was this the man who might bring destruction to the very people he was supposed to protect? The strange feelings kept coming back. The uneasy sense that things weren't as they seemed. Was it paranoia? Was his father really becoming someone else? Or was he just overthinking it? He had never questioned his father before, never dared to doubt him. The trust between them had been solid, rock solid, like the foundation of a house built to last. But what if that foundation was cracking beneath their feet, and no one had noticed until it was too late? The more the cop observed, the more he felt the strain. The tension between him and his father was palpable now, even when they didn't speak. What was it? Why was he feeling this way? What had changed? Could he trust the man who had raised him, who had been the cornerstone of his world? Was the father he once admired still the same? Or had something broken deep inside him? Something the cop couldn't yet understand? And then there was his daughter, the blind girl. His daughter, who couldn't see the danger that might be lurking in the very people who were supposed to protect her. What would she do if the very people she trusted the most turned out to be the ones she should fear? Was it possible that the blind girl could sense something was wrong before anyone else could? Was there a reason she clung to her father's presence so tightly? It wasn't just about the past now. It wasn't just about who they were. It was about who they were becoming, and what they were becoming together. A family that had once been strong, now unraveling from the inside out, held together by invisible strings, but slowly starting to snap. But the cop didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it. Not his father, not the man who had always been there. He couldn't bring himself to entertain the thought that his father could hurt the girl he loved so deeply. Could he? These questions lingered in the air between them, unanswered, unspoken, and in a way, they haunted the cop. But he ignored them. What choice did he have? Could he really question everything he had ever known? Could he truly confront the man who had taught him everything, who had been his rock? The silence between them spoke volumes. Every time they were in the same room, the cop felt a weight in the air. He could no longer ignore it. Something had changed. Something was broken. And it wasn't just the relationships. It was trust itself. The thing that held everything together had been shattered, and neither the cop nor his father knew how to fix it. What would it take to confront the monster that might be lurking in their home? Could they ever face the truth, or would they be forever bound by the secrets they kept from one another? Would the cop finally see what was really happening, or would it take a tragedy to wake him from his slumber? And most importantly, was his daughter safe? Or was the man who had been her protector, the one who swore to love her and guard her with everything he had, the very one who might be the most dangerous threat of all? What happens when a man is faced with the horrifying truth about the ones he loves most? When loyalty and love are tested in ways no one could ever imagine? What does he do when the unthinkable is staring him in the face, and he can no longer deny the darkness that has taken root in the very heart of his family? The questions linger, and the answers are yet to be found, but as the tension builds, one thing becomes clear. The cop's world is about to shatter, and with it, everything he has ever believed about family, love, and the cop's life, once built on a foundation of trust and duty, had become a series of cracks, widening slowly over time. On the outside, everything appeared as it always had. A respectable career, a devoted father, a loving husband. But beneath the surface, there was tension, silent, subtle, and impossible to ignore if you knew where to look. His marriage, once a bond that seemed unbreakable, had begun to fray. It wasn't that they didn't love each other. It was that they were no longer sure how to love each other. The days of late-night conversations, of dreams shared over coffee, were long gone. The cop's wife had noticed at first. She'd watched as her husband drifted into silence, his once vibrant smile replaced with the weariness of someone who carried too much. The distance between them wasn't physical. No, it was emotional, a subtle shift in how they looked at each other. Conversations became shorter, filled with more pauses and words. She had asked him more than once, "What's wrong? You don't talk to me anymore." But his response was always the same. "Nothing's wrong. I'm fine." But was he? Was anything truly fine in this house? His wife, too, had her own doubts about him, about their life together. The tension was palpable. She could feel it in the air every time they passed in the hallway, every time they ate dinner in silence. It wasn't the kind of conflict that erupted into shouting matches. No, it was the kind that quietly gnawed at the edges of their relationship, one small chip at a time, until one day, there was nothing left but the remnants of what they had once been. And the cop, he didn't know how to fix it. How could he, when the very thing he had built his life on, family, was now starting to slip through his fingers? Could he really face the truth? Could he admit that maybe, just maybe, his father wasn't the man he thought he was? But there were other things too, other shadows in the house, lurking in the corners, that the cop could no longer ignore. His father, the father who had raised him with such unwavering belief in duty and strength. The father who, in his old age, seemed to withdraw more and more into himself. The cop had brushed off the changes at first. Old age, he thought. Everyone changes. But the shifts were becoming more noticeable, more unsettling. The way his father moved differently. The way he seemed to look at his daughter a little too long, his hands trembling in ways they hadn't before. Could it have been nothing more than the signs of aging? Or was there something darker going on? It wasn't just his father. There was something in the way the cop's daughter clung to him, something that seemed to have shifted in the last few months. His once independent, playful daughter was more distant now. She withdrawn into herself, as if sensing something was wrong, but unable to express it. What had happened? Was she just growing up, or was she sensing the same disquiet in the house that he felt? On the night of the incident, the cop didn't know what to expect as he left the police station after a long shift. There was something nagging at him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, but he had learned over the years not to ignore his instincts. That night, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and the chill that ran through him wasn't from the cold air outside. It was a sense of impending doom, something that told him this night would be different from all the others. The house was dark when he arrived, save for the dim light in the kitchen. His wife had already gone to bed. At least, that's what he assumed. He hadn't seen her since his brief phone call earlier that evening. He had expected the house to be quiet, serene, the way it always was when everyone was asleep. But tonight, as he stood in the foyer, something felt off. The air was still, but it wasn't the kind of stillness that brought peace. It was a kind of silence that wraps around you, suffocating and thick, as though the house itself was holding its breath. As he moved through the house, he noticed small things that didn't add up. The blinds in the living room were drawn tight, but there was a sliver of light peeking through the edges. His daughter's door was slightly ajar, a small creak of the wood as if it had just been opened and closed. His father's shoes were by the door. Strange. His father hadn't been around much lately. He was usually at his own house, a few miles away. But tonight, there was something about the way his father's shoes were placed, as if he had been standing there, waiting. The cop moved through the house with caution now, his instincts sharper than ever. Every step felt heavier, like the floorboards themselves were warning him. And then, as he neared the hallway leading to his daughter's room, he heard it, the faintest sound, a noise he couldn't quite place, but it stopped him dead in his tracks. His heart started to race, and his breath quickened. He strained his ears, trying to make sense of it. But the silence quickly followed. What had he heard? Was he imagining things? Or had his mind, worn thin by the strain of the past few months, simply started to play tricks on him? He had to be sure. He had to know. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever he was about to find. His fingers brushed against the door handle, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to slow. The air grew colder, and that sense of impending doom, the one that had been gnawing at him for days, came crashing back. And then, with a quick twist of his wrist, he opened the door. What happened next would forever change everything. But what could possibly have led to such a moment? What could have driven a man, a father, a cop, to this point? Was this the culmination of a lifetime of strained relationships? Or was there something more, something darker at play? Could one horrible moment of discovery, one act of violence, really destroy a family so completely? Could there have been signs along the way that he had missed? Or had it all come down to this one catastrophic point of no return? As the door opened, the cop stood frozen, unable to process what was unfolding before his eyes. Could he have known? Could he have predicted it? Or was this the moment when everything finally broke? There were no easy answers, but there was only one question now. What would happen when the door creaked softly as the cop's hand pushed it open? The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and he felt the silence of the room like a living, breathing thing. It was thick, suffocating, as if the house itself had stopped functioning in anticipation of what was about to unfold. His heart hammered in his chest, louder than the sound of his footsteps. Inside, everything seemed frozen in time. His daughter's room, usually so full of light and laughter, was now shrouded in darkness. The faint glow of the moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. His daughter's bed was empty, the soft covers slightly askew as if she had just gotten up. But the absence was immediate and chilling. Her absence, the emptiness in her room, felt unnatural, like a wrongness that clung to the walls. And then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a quiet voice, a murmur, soft, almost like a whisper. His pulse quickened. He couldn't see her, couldn't see what was happening, but the noise that felt like it was drawing him in, pulling him deeper into something he wasn't ready for. His hand hovered near the doorframe, but he didn't dare move forward. What was this? Why was she not in bed? Where was she? The air around him grew heavier, as though every part of him was being drawn into the vortex of an unknowable truth. And then it came, the unmistakable sound of footstep, slow and deliberate, followed by another, and then the soft scraping of a chair being moved. The cop froze, his breath caught in his throat. What was happening? Who was in the room with his daughter? He felt the ground beneath him shift. His father's shoes, now in full view as they sat neatly by the door, seemed to mock him. His heart raced. The pieces were starting to align in his mind, but he couldn't allow himself to believe it. It couldn't be true. His father, the man who had raised him, who had been a rock in his life. He couldn't fathom it. Not him. But the tension in the air, the sound, the silence that came between the movements, told him everything he needed to know. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. His instincts, honed over years of service, screamed at him to turn away, to leave, to do anything but face the truth. But he couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, his breath shallow and unsteady. The weight of his duty and the weight of his family pressed down on him at once, creating a pressure that seemed to crush him from all sides. The soft murmur grew louder now, almost recognizable. His father's voice, low, soft, soothing, as if trying to calm his daughter. But the words were all wrong. Too comforting, too intimate. His heart twisted. His father, no, he didn't want to think about it. Couldn't think about it. But the voice, the words, spoke louder than his refusal. "It's okay," his father whispered. "I'm here." The cop's heart skipped. He clenched his fists, fighting the overwhelming urge to burst into the room. He had to do something. Anything, but his feet refused to move. He wasn't prepared for what he was about to see. Nothing in all his years could have prepared him for the sight that would forever be etched in his mind. His breath hitched as his eyes slowly adjusted to the dark. And then, as if everything slowed to a crawl, the cop's eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before him. It felt like an eternity, each second stretching into infinity. His father was sitting at the edge of his daughter's bed. The blind girl, her face pale and ghost-like in the dim light, sat quietly beside him, her hands resting in her lap. She seemed unaware, as though she was simply trusting, as she always did. But her body language, it spoke volumes. She was tense, unnaturally still, as if she could sense something was wrong, but was powerless to do anything about it. The cop's eyes went from his daughter's frail form to his father's hands. And that's when it hit him. The touch. It was wrong. His father's hand, his trembling, aging hand, resting on her shoulder, too close, too intimate. The room spun as the realization began to sink in, but he couldn't move. His mind raced with confusion, with disbelief, and with horror, each emotion fighting for dominance. He wasn't ready for this. Not his father. Not in a million years. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. His father's hand shifted slightly, and he saw it. The look on his daughter's face, wide eyes filled with confusion, fear, and an unspoken question. Why is this happening? Her innocence, once a shield that kept her safe in a world of shadows, now seemed fragile and vulnerable, torn apart in an instant. The cop's heart sank. He could hear his daughter's shallow breathing, her body stiffening under the weight of something she couldn't understand. And his father was the one responsible, the very man he had trusted most, the one who had protected him through childhood, the one who had guided him when he needed it. And now, he was the one who betrayed that trust, who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His mind screamed, no, this can't be real. But it was. He couldn't deny it. He couldn't turn away from it. And then, the worst part, the part that would haunt him forever, was a look in his father's eyes. There was no recognition, no remorse, only something else. Something he couldn't name, something that chilled him to his core. A look that said everything without saying a word. It was a look of entitlement, of possession, of a man who had decided, in his twisted mind, that this was his right. His daughter's body was tense, as if she was waiting for something. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Could she feel it? Could she sense the wrongness in the air before it became physical? Could she understand the danger that had been silently building in the shadows of their home? The cop's pulse quickened as his father's eyes met his. And in that moment, just that fleeting moment, everything in the room shifted. The bond between them was shattered. The cop's hands were shaking as the fury and confusion mixed with disbelief and sorrow. What should I do? The question echoed in his mind. Should he act? Should he confront his father right then? Or should he run, leave this nightmare behind? Was it even possible to confront the man who had given him life, a man who had shown him strength and leadership? But this wasn't strength. This wasn't leadership. This was something darker, something so deep that the cop's soul quaked with the knowledge of it. The tension in the air thickened, and every second felt like an eternity. His father's silence grew louder. His daughter's vulnerability stood in stark contrast to his own paralysis. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The moment of discovery had arrived, and it had changed everything. Was he justified in what he was about to do? Or was there another choice? Could anyone ever prepare for something like this? In that frozen moment, the cop understood something chilling. Once the truth is uncovered, there is no going back. There are no second chances. There is no way to undo the damage. And once you've seen a monster lurking in your own family, once you've witnessed the unthinkable, there is no hiding from it. But what would happen next? Would he confront his father? Would he run to protect his daughter? Or would the situation spiral into something darker than anyone could imagine? The cop stood on the precipice, his next move hanging in the air like the sharp edge of a knife. What would he do? What would you do? The world had slowed to a crawl. Time itself seemed to bend under the weight of the cop's realization. Every breath felt heavier than the last, the air thick with the scent of dust and the oppressive stillness that enveloped the room. His heart beat so loudly in his chest that it drowned out everything else. The weight of the gun in his hand, his own weapon, the one he had carried through countless situations before, now felt foreign, alien. It was a tool that stood between him and an unimaginable choice, and yet it felt useless. How could this be happening? How could it come to this? His eyes never left his father's face, still locked in that expression, half recognition, half defiance. His father's gaze was cold, calculating, and yet strangely calm, as though the line between right and wrong had been blurred beyond recognition. The cop's mind raced, his thoughts in turmoil. His body trembled slightly, betraying the intense conflict that waged within him. "This is my father," he thought, the words repeating over and over in his head. "This is the man who raised me, the man I admired, the man who is now a monster." His father's hand was still resting on his daughter's shoulder, his fingers too close, too intimate. The cop's stomach twisted in a knot, his blood running cold. He could see his daughter's face now, pale and wide-eyed. She didn't understand what was happening, couldn't understand, but she could feel it. He could see the vulnerability in her expression. She trusted him. She trusted this man. And in that moment, the cop knew she needed him to protect her. She needed him to fix this, to end this nightmare before it went any further. But can I do it? The question gnawed at him. Can I pull the trigger? Can I kill the man who gave me life? The man who taught me everything I know? His hands were shaking, but he gripped the gun tighter, his knuckles turning white from the strain. His mind spun as the gravity of the decision settled over him, suffocating every other thought. He had sworn an oath to protect, to serve. But how could he serve justice in this situation? How could he protect his daughter from a man who had once been a protector himself, only to become the very thing he swore to fight against? A moment passed. Only a moment, but it felt like hours. The silence between them was deafening. All that could be heard was the distant hum of the air conditioner, the soft rustling of the sheets, and his own ragged breathing. He couldn't look away from his father's eyes. Those eyes that once held warmth, once held love, now were cold, empty. Was he still the man I knew? The cop couldn't tell anymore. What would happen if I don't do anything? He thought, a shiver running down his spine. What will happen to my daughter? The conflict tore at him. He had spent years trusting this man. He had stood by his side through thick and thin. And now, here he was facing impossible. He had always believed in the law. But was there a law for this? Was there any justice to be found when the perpetrator was someone who should have been the ultimate protector? His father shifted, his grip on his daughter's shoulder tightening just a little more. She winced, but she didn't say anything. Her trust in him was unwavering, as it had always been. She couldn't see the danger, but she could feel it. Was she scared? He couldn't bear to think about it. How could this be happening in his home? How could it be happening to his little girl? And then his father spoke. "Don't do this," he said, his voice low, almost soothing. It was the voice of someone who knew what to say to calm a situation, but it felt wrong, unnatural. The calmness was a mask, one that didn't reach his eyes. The cop could hear the faintest tremor in his father's voice, a subtle crack that hinted at something darker beneath the surface. "Don't do this," his father repeated, this time more forcefully. "You know this isn't the way." The cop's grip tightened on the gun. His father's words hung in the air like a poison, twisting in his gut. What am I supposed to do? What is the right thing? He looked at his daughter again, her eyes wide, her lips trembling slightly as she sat motionless on the edge of the bed. She was so small, so innocent. Her blindness had always been something he could protect her from, until now. Now, it seemed that everything he had ever known was slipping away. Was he the one who had failed her? He had promised to keep her safe. And yet, here they were, in this moment, on the brink of something irreversible. The gun felt heavier in his hand with every passing second. His fingers seemed to betray him, twitching, as if they wanted to pull the trigger, but his mind wouldn't allow it. The cop wasn't sure how much time had passed. Minutes? Seconds? It all blurred together in a haze of confusion and pain. Can I do it? The question repeated, over and over, like an echo in the chambers of his mind. He had sworn an oath to serve and protect, to uphold the law. But here, in this room, in this moment, what law mattered? Could the law even define the choice before him? Could anything define what was happening right now? The tension was unbearable. Every breath he took felt like it might be his last. And still, he didn't move. He couldn't move. He was frozen, caught in a moment that stretched on for what felt like eternity. His father shifted again, his voice softer now. I raised you, son. You owe me. You know what's right. Let's not do something we'll both regret. Regret? The cop's jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck tightening. His father was trying to manipulate him, trying to twist the knife of guilt deeper. But the cop wasn't sure anymore. Was this the moment when everything he had ever believed would shatter? Could he forgive himself if he didn't act? Could he live with what would happen to his daughter if he did nothing? He could hear his father's breathing now, steady and calm. His daughter's breathing, shallow and soft, like a fragile bird afraid to take flight. And then, finally, his body moved. The tension in the air snapped, like a wire pulled too tight, breaking at the slightest touch. He raised a gun. But what happened next was something no one could have predicted. No one could have prepared for the shattering decision that the cop was about to make. Would he pull the trigger? Would he stop his father from crossing the line any further, from destroying the last piece of innocence in his home? Was there any going back from this? The sound of sirens echoed in the stillness of night, a constant reminder that nothing would ever be the same again. The cop stood frozen, his mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. His father lay motionless on the floor in the room, once a safe haven, now felt like a crime scene, tainted, shattered beyond repair. His body still trembled, but not from fear. It was from the weight of the decision he had just made, the weight of the consequences that would follow. He hadn't meant for it to happen. No, of course not. This wasn't the way things were supposed to play out. But the reality was undeniable. His action, swift and irreversible, had set in motion a chain of events that would tear apart not just his family, but the entire fabric of the life he had built. The door burst open, and the sound of approaching footsteps dragged him back to the present. He had no time to think, no time to prepare. It was all happening too fast. The police had arrived. His own colleagues, his brothers and sisters in blue, were now the ones who would arrest him as the perpetrator of an unimaginable crime. The irony wasn't lost on him. But in this moment, there was no room for irony. There was only the cold, unforgiving reality that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Hands behind his back, the weight of the cuffs tightened around his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. It wasn't the first time he had been on the other side of an arrest, but this was different. This wasn't just any crime. This wasn't just a case of someone else's wrongdoing. This was his story, his family's story, and it was now playing out in the harsh light of the law. As the officers led him out of the house, the reality of the situation hit harder than the cuffs. The house he had once called home, the place he had built with his own hands, now felt like a foreign land. He glanced back over his shoulder, but he didn't see his wife's face. He didn't hear his daughter's cries. All he heard was the cold echo of his own breath, mingling with the flashing red and blue lights outside. It didn't take long for the entire neighborhood to be shaken awake by the police response. Officers from every precinct arrived within minutes. News helicopters hovered overhead, casting shadows on the streets as the story began to unfold. On a scale so large, it felt impossible to contain. The press arrived quickly, their cameras snapping photos, their microphones thrusting toward any officer willing to speak. They wanted to know everything. They wanted the details. And the cop's face, his name, his story, was now the centerpiece of every headline. The question started immediately. What had happened? What led to this shooting? What had the cop been thinking? Was this an act of self-defense? Or something darker? Each question was like a blade, twisting deeper as the days wore on. The media coverage was relentless, unforgiving. The cop, once a respected member of the community, now found himself in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. He had never been prepared for the public judgment that would follow. The same people who had once looked to him for protection were now questioning his every action. The phone calls flooded in, family, friends, even colleagues, each one asking for an explanation he couldn't give. His own words seemed to betray him, hanging in the air like a question he couldn't answer. The most painful part of the aftermath was watching how his family reacted. His wife, who had already been struggling with the emotional distance between them, now found herself at the center of a storm she never could have predicted. She sat in silence as the police questioned her face a mask of confusion and disbelief. What could she say? What could she possibly understand of the unimaginable thing that had just occurred in her own home? And then there was his daughter, his sweet blind girl. She didn't understand what had just happened. How could she, the image of her father, once a protector, now reduced to a man in cuffs, was too much for her to process? What would she think of him now? Would she ever trust him again? How would this change her forever? She couldn't see the horror in her eyes, but the cop could feel it, the weight of that unspoken question hanging in the air. Will she ever look at me the same way again? His father's actions had caused a rift so deep, so unthinkable, that even his family couldn't comprehend the full depth of it. They couldn't understand why he hadn't stopped his father sooner. They couldn't grasp the emotional conflict he had been wrestling with. How could they? The cop didn't know how to explain the choices he had made. He didn't know how to make sense of it himself. Every word seemed to come out wrong, every attempt at justification falling flat. As the days passed, the legal ramifications began to unfold. The investigation was swift. The details were slow to come out, but the charges were clear. He had shot his father. That was indisputable. But the why, the motive, the intent, it wasn't so easy to answer. The prosecutor's office had its own set of questions. Was this a crime of passion? Or was there a deeper motive at play? Was it self-defense? Or something far darker? The defense team was already working to build a case, but could they find a way to justify what had happened? Could they convince the court that this had been an act of survival, an act of a man who was pushed to his breaking point? And what about the public? The court of public opinion was swift, cruel, and unyielding. Some would call him a hero, a man who did what was necessary to protect his daughter. But others, many others, would see him as a murderer, someone who crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. How could the system hold a man accountable for an act that was so full of complexity, so full of internal struggle? Could there be justice when the lines between right and wrong had been blurred so completely? The cop's mind was in turmoil. There were no easy answers. In the quiet moments, he found himself replaying events over and over again, searching for the moment when everything could have been different. Could he have stopped himself from pulling the trigger? Could he have done something, anything, to avoid the point of no return? Regret? It gnawed at him. Had he done the right thing? Could there ever be a right thing when you're forced to make a choice between family and justice? He had loved his father. He had trusted him. But in that moment, his father had become something else, a stranger, a predator. And the cop had been forced to act. Was that justified? Was there any justification for what he had done? Could he live with the knowledge that he had killed his own flesh and blood? What if I hadn't pulled the trigger? The thought haunted him, as if there was a different version of this nightmare, where everything turned out differently. But the truth was he couldn't know, and he would never get the chance to go back and change it. The cop couldn't escape the thought, what happens now? His family, his career, his life, everything had been shattered in an instant. Could he rebuild it? Could he ever find redemption? Or was he lost in a world where he could no longer protect the people he loved? The days were heavy with uncertainty. The fallout from the shooting had only just begun, and the consequences, both legal and emotional, would continue to ripple through his life, changing everything. What would the next chapter hold? Would justice be served? Would he find peace with what he had done? Or would he live with the consequences for the rest of his life? Trapped in a world where the line between good and evil had been permanently blurred, the questions lingered unanswered as the cop faced the aftermath of his decision, a decision that would haunt him forever. The days following the shooting were filled with confusion and chaos. The neighborhood that once felt safe, untouched by anything so gruesome, was now the center of a storm. The shooting of a respected cop, his own father lying dead on the floor. This was a case that would ripple through community, through the justice system, and into the lives of everyone involved. But no one, not even the cop himself, could have predicted how deep the investigation would go, or how the truth would slowly begin to unravel. The first few hours were filled with the standard procedures: securing the crime scene, gathering evidence, questioning witnesses. But this wasn't a typical case. This wasn't just another police shooting. The cop, now the suspect, was someone they all knew, someone who worked alongside them, who had sworn the same oath, who had been their comrade. And now, that bond had shattered, replaced with suspicion and doubt. The detectives on the case, experienced and methodical, knew that the first step was to piece together the narrative. What had happened that night? Was this a tragic accident, an act of self-defense, or something far darker? As the investigators sifted through the evidence, photos, fingerprints, ballistics reports, they began to form a picture, one that was still incomplete, still fragile. The gun that the cop had used was examined carefully, its trajectory, its recoil, its markings, all scrutinized. But the physical evidence was only one piece of the puzzle. The crucial question, was the shooting justified? Would ultimately come down to the emotional and psychological state of the cop, his intent, and what had been happening inside the house in the days and weeks leading up to that fateful night. The officers who had been closest to the cop were interviewed first. His colleagues, those who had worked alongside him for years, were confused, shaken. How could someone they trusted with their lives be capable of such an act? There were no clear answers. Some tried to offer their support, while others began to question his judgment. Could this have been an act of rage? Could it have been something more calculated? Their doubts only deepened as the investigation continued. But then came the first hint that this wasn't as simple as it appeared. The officers who were the closest to the cop found evidence of emotional strain, the tension between him and his father, the disconnection from his family. Could these signs have been ignored? Could they have been a warning that something far more sinister was brewing beneath the surface? As the investigation progressed, the expert opinions began to pile in. A psychologist was called in to assess the cop's state of mind. What had been his mental state when he made that fateful decision? Was he acting in self-defense, or had he crossed a line into something darker, driven by emotions and unresolved trauma? The expert analysis was thorough, diving deep into his past, his relationships, and his history of trauma and strain. The more they dug, the more they found. The psychologist described the cop's possible state of mind as a toxic mix of rage, fear, and betrayal. The experts argued that, in his emotional state, the cop may have acted without fully processing the severity of his actions. But could that be enough to justify taking another life? Could it be enough to excuse the unthinkable? Meanwhile, the defense team began to piece together a narrative that aligned with this theory. The cop was acting out of a deeply ingrained need to protect, driven by years of emotional tension that had finally boiled over. They painted the picture of a man who had snapped, a man who had been pushed to the brink by his own father's betrayal and the betrayal of his family. But the prosecution wasn't so easily swayed. The evidence pointed to a different possibility, one of premeditation, one of a cold, calculated decision that had been made in the heat of the moment. Could there have been another way? Could the cop have intervened without resorting to violence? The prosecution didn't think so. As the evidence was presented, the room was filled with tension. Each piece added more weight to the argument, each witness's testimony more damning than the last. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had made a choice, perhaps out of necessity, perhaps out of desperation, but a choice that could not be excused. The trial itself was a spectacle. The courtroom, once a place of order, was now a battleground. The cop, one a figure of respect, was now a defendant. The judge, stern and unwavering, watched as the drama unfolded. The prosecution presented their case with precision, showing the cop's history, his strained relationship with his father, and the emotional toll of the past few months. They focused on the final moments, the moment the cop pulled the trigger. Was it a split-second decision driven by fear, or was it the culmination of something far darker? The defense team fought back fiercely, presenting expert testimony, medical records, and emotional accounts of the cop's mental state. They argued that his actions, while tragic, were the result of overwhelming pressure. What would anyone do in his shoes? They asked. The defense attempted to make the jury see the cop not as a murderer, but as a man driven to the edge by a lifetime of unresolved trauma. But it wasn't just a testimony that weighed heavily in the room. It was the emotional toll that each person took on the stand. His wife was called to testify, her face pale, her eyes filled with both confusion and pain. How could she possibly explain what had happened? She had been part of this family, too. How could she reconcile the man she had once loved with the man who had taken a life in such a violent way? Her testimony was raw, painful, and heart-wrenching as she tried to make sense of the man she thought she knew. His daughter, still unable to fully understand the gravity of the situation, was brought into the courtroom as well. Her fragile presence stood in stark contrast to the heated arguments swirling around her. She was the victim, but she was also the one caught in the middle of a family destroyed. How would she see her father now? What would she think of him when she was old enough to understand? The trial had become a public spectacle. Every day, the press swarmed the courthouse, capturing every moment, every argument, every tear. The cop's once respected reputation was slowly eroding in front of the world. His colleagues, his friends, now saw him as something different. Someone who could no longer be trusted. Someone who had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. The prosecution's closing statement was filled with passion, calling for justice for the victim, his father. The argument was clear. No matter the circumstances, no matter the emotional weight, the cop had killed a man, a father, and now he must answer for it. But the defense, in their final plea, begged the jury to consider the man's state of mind, the years of emotional turmoil that had led up to this point. Could a man who had been broken in such a way be held fully responsible for his actions? Was it truly murder? Or had it been an act of self-preservation, an instinct to protect his daughter? As the final arguments were made, the tension in the room was palpable. The jury had to make a choice that would determine not just the fate of the cop, but the fate of an entire family. The room held its breath. What would they decide? Would they find him guilty, or would they find a way to absolve him of his actions? As the jury filed out of the courtroom to deliberate, the questions lingered. Could justice truly be served in a case like this? Could the cop ever find redemption, or would his past actions haunt him for the rest of his life? What would happen to his family? What would happen to his daughter? Could they ever rebuild what had been destroyed, or had the damage been too great? The trial wasn't over, and neither was the suspense. The final outcome was still to be determined, and the world would be watching closely as the drama unfolded. Would justice be served, or would this case become one of the many unanswered questions that would linger in the minds of everyone involved? The cop's fate and the fate of his family now rested in the hands of 12 strangers. Would they see the truth, or would they see only a man who had crossed a line? The answers, hidden in the balance of justice, were still to come. The case of the Michigan cop who shot his father is one that will forever haunt those who followed it. The tragedy unfolded before the world's eyes, but as the dust settles, it leaves us with more questions and answers. Was the cop justified in his actions? Could he have made a different decision? Could anyone truly understand the emotional toll of that fateful night? In the aftermath, the cop's life was forever changed. His arrest and trial marked the end of a career that had once promised honor, respect, and purpose. The man who had once protected others was now fighting for his own freedom. Could he ever find redemption in a system that was unforgiving and brutal in its pursuit of justice? Or was the damage done beyond repair? And what of his daughter, the innocent victim in this family's nightmare? How does one recover from the realization that the very people you trusted, the ones who were supposed to protect you, have betrayed that trust in the most unimaginable way? Could she ever rebuild the shattered sense of security that had been torn from her so violently? The family, too, was left in ruins. There were no winners in this tragedy. The cop's wife, once a partner, now found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. How could she possibly explain to her daughter the unexplainable? Could their family ever be whole again, or had the foundation of their lives been irrevocably broken? This case isn't just about a man and the terrible decision he made. It's about the intricate web of family, loyalty, and love that tangled them all together. How could a man who once looked at his father with admiration ever pull the trigger on him? Was it an act of protection? Was it the inevitable result of years of unspoken tension? Or was it something else, something darker, more hidden within the fabric of their family? What happens when justice becomes muddled by emotions, by the ties of blood that bind us to those we love and hate in equal measure? The decision the cop made that night wasn't just a physical one. It was a moral battle, a fight between duty and family, between love and pain. Was he justified in his actions, or did he become a product of his environment, of the unresolved trauma that had haunted him for years? Could anyone, given the same circumstances, have made a different choice? These questions linger unanswered. The story, though coming to an end, leaves us with something deeper to ponder. As viewers, we are forced to examine ourselves. Could we have made the same decision? In the heat of the moment, with everything on the line, when the boundaries between right and wrong blur in the face of betrayal, would we have acted any differently? Would we have been able to walk away, to call for help, or would we, too, have been driven by the overwhelming need to protect the ones we love at all costs? This story isn't just a tragedy for the cop or his family. It's a tragedy for all of us. It reminds us of the fragile line we all walk between love, duty, and the unthinkable. If this case has left you thinking, if it has made you question what you would have done in that moment, then this is just the beginning. The world is filled with stories like this. Stories of moral dilemmas, of lives torn apart by decisions made in the blink of an eye. To get more gripping, true crime stories that leave you questioning everything, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We'll take you inside the darkest corners of real-life events, showing you the human stories that you won't find in any textbook. But remember, this is not just about crime. It's about understanding the very essence of human choices, of what drives us, and of the irreversible consequences that follow. So, take a moment. Reflect on the questions posed here today. Could you have made the same decision? And let us know in the comments below, what would you have done in that moment? Join us on this journey. Together, we will explore the stories that make us question everything we thought we knew. Subscribe now, and let's uncover the truth one story at a time.